Here we are at Devil's Point in Plymouth at low tide, and as you can see there's lots and lots of seaweed exposed at low tide, so let's get picking. It's important when collecting seaweed to only take parts of the plant. You shouldn't take the whole thing, because then you're removing the whole plant from the ecosystem. But if you only remove a small part of it, then it can regrow. It's also a good idea to only collect individuals that are already detached and are floating around in the surf, because they're unlikely to reattach, and so you're not taking healthy specimens from the system. It's a good idea to look at how different species look underwater compared to when they do out of it. This red species here looks relatively unremarkable, but when you put it underwater you can see its beautiful feathery structure that would look great pressed against watercolour paper. And if you compare it to this species, because it's a lot more rigid, it looks almost exactly the same out of water as it does in water. The thinner the species is, the better it's likely to come out looking on watercolour paper, because it will act a bit like stained glass effect. These really thin green alba species, when they're spread out over paper and they dry, can look really beautiful as the green colour really shines through. Whereas these racks, they look almost exactly the same when dried on paper. Some red algae, when they start to die, they start to lose a lot of the pigment and the chloroplast in their cells, and that thinning can actually make them look even more beautiful when pressed against watercolour paper. As you can see, it's much lighter and finer and more transparent compared to its healthier relatives out next to it. If you're collecting kelp, be careful not to select young, new individuals like these. That'll be the basis of the next population. These are still quite small, so if you're going to take kelps from the beach, it's best to only take ones that are already detached or fronds that are broken off. And while you're rooting around collecting for seaweed, you might even notice some other interesting marine life around in Plymouth, like this beautiful anemone. So now it's time to press the seaweed that we've collected. I've brought all the seaweed home and washed it, and I've separated it into trays that are, a lot of these are red, flatter algae. Some of these are browns and more rigid. A lot of these are green alga. We have some of the more filamentous reds and some of the stringier reds. So I've split them all up into sections. It's just easier to work with compared to a bowl full of algae, which can be hard to sort of see what you're doing. Some of the other things you'll need is paintbrushes or tweezers, an old toothbrush, anything like that. Something that once the algae is on the paper, you can use that to manipulate the algae onto the paper. You need some scissors to trim any excess bits of the algae that you don't want. I have here a mixture of blotting paper and old watercolour paper that I use whenever I'm drying algae. I'll explain to you at what stage I'll use that at, but I reuse the same sheets over and over again. Once they've been used, I put them on the radiators to dry, just like I do with the newspapers. You'll need some folded up old bits of newspapers, some plain paper. It doesn't matter the colour or what type of paper it is. Again, it's paper that I've used time and time again and dried it after each use. And then I recommend using watercolour paper to actually press the algae on. So this is 250 GSM watercolour paper. You can see that it's textured, and because it has a weight, it'll warp less once the algae is dried onto it, and because it's quite absorbent, the natural glues in the algae stick to it. And you'll also need some corrugated cardboard. It doesn't really matter what shapes they are, as long as each piece of paper can rest on it and you can build layers of your press. Okay, so now I'm going to show you how I press the algae. I take a household dish with just a shallow layer of water in it. It doesn't need to be too deep, but just enough to submerge my watercolour paper into, like so. Now, the reason I put this underwater in the first place is because I took this piece of algae and I tried to position it onto the piece of paper, it doesn't look particularly impressive and its shape is lost. It's hard to manipulate it with your fingers once it's out of water. But when you put it underwater, it acts a little bit as if it's how you would have seen it out on the beach. And you can use a paintbrush, an old pencil, back of a pen, tweezers, anything that works for you, whatever you can find, to position it onto the piece of paper as you like, and you can really show off the features of the algae. Any excess bits that have torn off, some of them do give off a lot of filaments that stick to the piece of paper, but you can remove them once the algae is dried. But here I'm happy with how I positioned the algae. And now the tricky bit comes now in lifting this out of the water without losing too much of the definition that you've built. So it's just a case of doing it really, really slowly. Like so. And if there's any bits that you're not happy with or have changed, you can re-wet your paintbrush. And just readjust it. Like so. Just adding a bit of moisture allows the fronds to be spread out again. And there we have it. And now what I'll do is I'll just pop that to one side. Okay, so now I'm going to show you, once the algae's been set onto the piece of paper, what to do next. I'll take a piece of cardboard that I showed you earlier. I'll add a layer of newspaper. Onto that I'll add an old piece of blotting paper. As you can see, it's been used quite a few times. But that way you don't have to keep buying more and more paper. It's a lot more sustainable. You keep using the same pieces of material. On top of that blotting paper, I'll place the dried, the algae placed onto the watercolour paper. You can place as many as you want as long as the algae aren't overlapping. And one thing I forgot to say earlier is a piece of netting. If you place that on top of the algae, before adding another piece of paper onto it, what it means is that the algae won't stick to the top piece of paper. It will only stick to that piece of watercolour paper that's under it that you set it on. Otherwise, if you stick paper directly to it, it'll stick to both pieces, and when you go to open it apart, the algae will tear apart. So just any old piece of netting. You can use old stockings or a wedding veil. I use cheap offcuts of plastic mesh off eBay. Then on top of that, I'll place another piece of blotting paper. As you can see, it's already starting to absorb a lot of that water from the algae. Place about 3 or 4 pieces of plain paper on top of it. And another piece of newspaper. And then finally on top of that, I'll add another layer of cardboard. And that's that one layer of the press done. And what that means is, if you lift it up like this, the spaces in the corrugated cardboard that you can see, as the air moves through those spaces, it will carry away the moisture, whilst the piece of paper that the algae is on stays flat while it dries. And I can build as many layers as I want. Here I have a few previous week's layers going, so I have about 6 layers here. You can build up as many layers as you want, as long as each one is separated by the same layers, sandwiched together. Place them on top of each other, and then you can place on top of this any weight that you have in the house, as long as it's evenly spread out over its surface. It's not concentrated on one half or the other. So I often use old books. I have some old offcuts of marble that's quite heavy and flat that goes quite well on top of this. I've used jars with lentils and rice and things that you can weigh it down with, whatever you can find. And then what I do after that, I'll show you, is that over the next 2 or 3 days, I'll change the newspaper, the plain paper, and the blotting paper on each side, on this side of the algae and the other side of the algae. But I won't take it off the watercolour paper that it's on. And this netting will ensure that it doesn't stick to the paper on top of it. That way I'm removing a lot of the moisture that's on top of the algae. And that then means is you remove most of the moisture over doing 3 to 4 changes. So over the course of 3 to 4 days, you remove it every day. And then once that's happened, I will leave it for a final 2 to 3 weeks without any changes in its final press. And I'll show you now some of the ones that I've done earlier. Here are the ones that have had 3 to 4 days of changes and are now in their final press for about 2 to 3 weeks. And I'll show you how they're looking. So that's removing the blotting paper. That's the veil on top of it. And as you can see, these have completely dried onto the surface of the watercolour paper, but they're not stuck to anything else. Most importantly, not to the paper that was on top of it drying them. And as you can see, as I was talking to you earlier when I was at the beach, the thinner the texture of the algae and the finer the texture, the more colour will show through of the watercolour paper through it, like a stained glass window. So red algae and some of the greens are particularly good at doing that, but some of the brown algae are quite good at that too. The thinner the algae is, the better it will show up. And another technique I use is that once I've collected the algae from the beach, I will soak it in fresh water overnight, all of the algae that I collect. And what that happens is some of the thinner algae like these, as they're already dead anyway, they're in the process of bleaching, they'll lose some of their cells, and because they're a saltwater algae, putting them in fresh water means that there's an influx of water into their cells, so the cell walls burst, releasing a lot of the pigment, which means that some of this really dark pigment is lost, bringing forward some of this transparency that really shows off their colours. And these, as you can see, are pretty much dry, and so they're ready to frame.